The villagers said the fog came first. It moved across the valley like a living sermon, pale and unbroken, swallowing fences, treetops, and chapel stones until only the church bell remained above it like a drowning hand. On that morning in 1894, the world felt paused, drained of color, waiting for something that had already begun. In the distance, the river barely murmured. Birds offered no sound. Even the cattle refused to stir in their stalls, as if some instinct deeper than breath warned them to remain still. Elias Ward, the last portrait photographer for 50 miles, stepped from his carriage and felt the hush settle over him. His boots pressed into the damp earth, leaving impressions that filled almost instantly with water. He looked up at the church, half faded in the fog, its cross leaning as though exhausted by faith itself. The village had sent for him urgently. A wealthy patron wanted photographs of the church interior before renovation began. Easy work, simple money, nothing more. At least, that was the belief he clung to. Inside his case lay the camera that fed him. A polished mahogany body, a brass lens, and plates clean to a spotless mirror. It was a machine that saw everything and judged nothing. Through it, Elias made widows eternal and children unforgettable. Memory was his craft, and death had always been good business. What he never expected was for death to turn and claim authorship over him. The fog curled behind him as he approached the church doors. They were swollen with moisture, carved with saints whose eyes seemed blind and sorrowful. He braced one hand against the wood and pushed. The hinges groaned like something waking unwillingly. The scent that escaped was cold incense and old stone, but beneath it lingered something metallic, faint, like the taste of blood on a bitten tongue. He stepped inside. No candles burned. No caretaker waited with a ring of keys. No choir of voices rehearsed hymns in the loft. Only silence, pure and unbroken, settled over the pews and altar. Sunlight managed only thin, strangled beams through stained glass saints, turning their painted wounds into trembling stars on the floor. Elias exhaled and set down his equipment. He had photographed churches before. They were reliable subjects, obedient and solemn. But this one felt different, too aware, too expectant. As though an audience already waited in the shadows, he worked methodically. He always worked methodically, tripod extended, plate prepared, lens cleaned, focus set. He lifted the camera and peered through the ground glass. For a moment, nothing unusual. Pews, altar, crucifix. Then the air shifted. A figure stood near the chancel rail. Elias jerked back from the lens, startled, heart clenching once before catching rhythm again. He looked at the church with his naked eye, empty, only silence and cold stone. He swallowed, leaned in again, and peered once more through the camera's view. The figure remained. A man-shaped shadow, tall, head bowed, hands clasped, as if in mournful devotion. No face, no features, just darkness where details should have been. Elias blinked and stepped back again. Empty. The nave remained barren, abandoned, as though the church had not known a living step in years. It had to be fatigue, a trick of light. He had traveled overnight. His mind was tired. The camera merely played games with what little sun filtered through colored glass. He steadied himself and resumed. Plate loaded. Cloth over the head. Focus adjusted. The shadow stood closer now. He froze, breath suspended. His pulse became a physical thing, pressing at his throat. He stepped away, dizzy. Again, nothing there. Only rows of empty pews stretching toward an altar draped in white cloth. He shut his eyes and told himself he believed in reason. In science, in optics and exposure and measurable light. But reason felt thin in this place, like a thread pulled too tightly. The fog outside pressed pale light against the stained glass. The church seemed to breathe with it, subtle, slow, expanding and contracting like the chest of a sleeping beast. Elias forced himself to focus on his work. One photograph, just one. Then he would leave and blame the rest on exhaustion. He positioned the plate, adjusted the lens, held the shutter cord in his fingers like a rosary. He took the first photograph. The shutter opened. The mechanism clicked. The moment was trapped. Nothing unusual happened in the room, and the ordinary quiet returned. Elias exhaled. He developed the plate immediately in the small basin he carried for travel. Chemicals swirled across glass. Shapes bloomed from silver and shadow. The pews appeared. The altar, the cross, and the figure, not distant, not vague. Standing directly behind him in the frame, a hand resting on his shoulder, Elias dropped the plate. It shattered on the stones, silver and glass splintering like a wounded mirror. He stumbled back, clutching the edge of a pew to steady himself. His breath came shallow and desperate. His eyes darted across the church, expecting movement, expecting breath, expecting footsteps. Nothing. He was alone. But the plate had not lied. The church, however, seemed pleased by his panic. The silence no longer felt empty. It felt watchful. The fog outside thickened against the windows. The air in the nave cooled further, the temperature sinking unnaturally, as though the church were pulling heat from the very bones of the living. Elias considered leaving. He should have left. But fear has a curious nature. Sometimes it roots instead of driving one away. And the camera, that cursed, faithful witness, had shown him something no eye could dismiss. If his lens could truly see what stood beyond sight, then he needed one more photograph. Not out of courage, not out of greed, but out of the terror of the unknown. The mind can endure horror better than uncertainty. He prepared a second plate, hands shaking, movement slower, breath uneven. He positioned the camera not toward the altar this time, but toward the entrance, toward the great doors where he had first stepped in. If something walked these aisles unseen, the lens would catch it. He lifted the cloth, peered through the glass, and froze. The figure stood at the doors, closer, clearer, arms now at its sides. Its form dark and elongated, but its head slightly tilted as though studying him. No eyes, yet unmistakably watching. Elias trembled, but he did not look away. The cloth draped over his head like a funeral veil. His fingers tightened on the shutter cord. He pulled. The second photograph was taken. Before he could reach for the plate, the church doors thundered, once violently, as if struck by something colossal. Elias staggered back, stumbling over a pew. The fog outside pressed harder against the stained glass until it seemed the church floated in a white, soundless void. The world beyond had vanished. Something was inside with him, and it did not intend for him to leave. His hands shook as he developed the second plate. The image emerged like a bruise forming beneath skin. The doors stood closed in the photograph, but the figure was gone, and on the floor before the doors, written in a dark smear, were words that stained the plate like rotten scripture: "You should not have come." Elias felt the weight of the church's silence deepen, thick and suffocating. The air tasted metallic again. The camera waited behind him, hungry for its next witness. He knew with cold certainty that he would not leave without taking a third photograph, and that the church, whatever dwelled in it, was waiting for exactly that. For the first time in his life, Elias Ward wished he had never learned how to trap souls in silver, because now something wanted to trap his. Elias stayed in his apartment for days after returning from the valley, moving quietly through the narrow rooms as if careful not to disturb the air itself. The camera he had recovered rested on his desk beside the worn envelope of photographs, but he avoided looking at either for long. He convinced himself this caution was discipline, a simple decision to wait until his thoughts sharpened. But beneath the surface lived a smaller truth he refused to name. The silence inside his home felt altered. Every step, Every breath, every settling groan in the wood seemed to carry an unseen counterpart, as though something listened with patient interest. He tried to restore routine, waking before dawn, preparing coffee, staring through the window at nameless people walking below. He read the news without absorbing a line, letting the act of turning pages pretend at normalcy. Yet the hours would pass without weight, empty and translucent, until the room dimmed and he realized he had not truly moved through the day at all, only drifted inside it. The world outside continued, but his own hours no longer anchored to anything familiar. On the third night he sat at the desk again, hands folded, eyes fixed on the sealed envelope. He tried to remember how it felt to be curious only for the sake of curiosity, to chase images for composition, shadow and light. Before Valle Osura, he had believed a photograph captured reality. Now he could not shake the sense that a photograph might also reveal something reality hid. The difference unsettled him. He opened the envelope with deliberate calm, intending to study only one image, nothing more. He chose the clearest print, the one he had found in the church, the portrait of the vanished photographer. The man in the image stared forward with steady intensity, his expression unreadable, his features sharply defined as though etched rather than captured by film. Elias held the image at arm's length, then closer, searching for a flaw in the exposure, a distortion, anything he could label as an effect of age or environment. But the more he studied the portrait, the more it felt as if the image studied him in return. The weight of that sensation built gradually, tightening behind his ribs. He set the photo down, turning it face down on the desk and leaned back. The room remained silent, yet the quiet no longer resembled peace. He went to bed hours later but slept shallowly, his body exhausted while his thoughts drifted through scenes he did not fully understand. He woke before sunrise with the taste of cold air in his lungs, though the windows were closed. The photo remained on the desk where he left it, but he avoided looking in that direction as he dressed and left the apartment, hoping movement and noise might dissolve whatever shadow had settled in his mind. He walked through the city without destination, letting streets lead him nowhere. The noise, the motion, the strangers, all of it should have dragged him back into the present, but the world felt distant, as though viewed through old glass. He returned home late, unsettled by how quickly daylight now slipped through his fingers. Time no longer unfolded as a sequence, but as a smudge. He paused outside his door, listening, though he could not explain what he expected to hear. The stillness inside the apartment felt heavier than when he had left it, like a held breath. Night deepened around him over the following days. Sleep grew scarce. Each time fatigue pulled him down into dreaming, he found himself standing again in the ruined church, tracing footsteps through the dust, gazing at the empty space where the congregation should have stood. The pews appeared intact at first, lit by soft morning light, but the scene always decayed without warning. The wood blackened, the air thickened, and sound receded until the entire church became a held note with no melody. The dream never reached a conclusion. He woke with a tightened chest, and the lingering impression that someone had been standing just behind him, silent and motionless, waiting. The photographs soon migrated from the envelope to the surface of his desk. He told himself he examined them only to identify inconsistencies, but his attention lingered too long on the portrait of the man whose studio had been abandoned. The photographer's eyes anchored Elias, holding him in a gaze that felt neither hostile nor kind, only intent. Sometimes Elias caught himself glancing away suddenly as though breaking eye contact. He began turning the portrait face down each night before leaving the room. One morning he discovered the portrait face up again. He tried to believe he had forgotten to turn it over, but his certainty disagreed. He turned it face down a second night. Again by morning it lay face up. On the third night he slipped the portrait back into the envelope instead. When he woke, the envelope remained sealed, but he knew before opening it what he would find. The portrait lay on top of the desk, clear and uncovered, as though it belonged there. He stopped touching it after that. The shift inside him continued inaudibly. His reflection became difficult to meet. Mirrors unsettled him without reason. He caught himself avoiding windows at night, disturbed by the idea that darkness outside might reveal something waiting in the glass. The boundaries between object, image, memory, and moment thinned. He remained composed, outwardly calm, but his composure felt stretched, like thread drawn too tight. He did not speak of any of this. There was no one he trusted with the truth, and silence felt safer than explanation. In the evenings he sat on the edge of his bed, staring into the dim hallway beyond his door. He listened to the quiet in a way that suggested expectation, though he never admitted he was waiting. He began to sense a presence, not as sound or motion, but as awareness. It felt as though something shared the apartment with him, patient and observant, neither advancing nor retreating. The awareness remained tethered to the photographs, but its reach felt longer each night. He lived inside cautious stillness, a ritual of restraint, unwilling to acknowledge the growing pressure in his mind. He stopped visiting the places he once frequented. His phone remained unread. His meals grew small and infrequent. The apartment became both refuge and confinement. Each day ended with the portrait staring from the desk, and each morning began with its gaze already waiting. A week passed. Then another. He woke one night without knowing why and sat upright, pulse steady, but breath shallow. The apartment felt colder. His eyes adjusted, finding familiar shapes in the darkness. The doorway, the chair, the desk. He told himself to lie back down and close his eyes, but sleep did not return. Instead, he sat motionless, listening. He sensed that if he rose and crossed the room, the portrait would be waiting in the same position it held each morning, perfectly aligned, perfectly still, with the eyes of a man, long vanished, watching him through a moment captured decades ago. The awareness pressed gently at the edges of his mind, as though asking to be acknowledged. He stared into the shadows until numbness replaced fear. The night stretched on without measure. Eventually dawn arrived, pale and thin, but brought no warmth. He rose mechanically, crossed the room, and approached the desk. The portrait lay where he expected, face up, precisely centered. He no longer questioned how. The quiet inside him shifted that morning. Something surrendered, though he would not have described it that way. He accepted the portrait's presence the way one accepts gravity. It remained constant, invisible, undeniable. He did not move it again. He lived around it as one might live around a scar. The days continued, but his world contracted. He stopped opening the curtains. He grew accustomed to dimness, finding comfort in shade where forms softened and details blurred. In darkness he felt less observed, though he could not silence the knowledge that observation persisted regardless of light. His dreams evolved, growing quieter yet more vivid. He no longer stood in the abandoned church. Instead, he walked corridors that did not belong to any structure he recognized, narrow and windowless. Their walls lined with frames containing images he never lifted his eyes to see. He felt the presence behind him always, close but not touching, leading without words, guiding without step. He followed because turning back felt impossible, as though the hall itself allowed movement in only one direction. He woke each time before reaching the final door. The tension within him no longer resembled fear. It became something else, a muted surrender, a suspended awareness, a willingness to endure rather than resist. He did not know when this transformation began, only that it felt complete by the time he noticed it. His silence deepened into acceptance. Whatever moved through his life, through his home, through his thoughts, had already settled its claim. On the 12th night, He sat at the desk again and placed his hand beside the portrait without touching it. He stared at the image until his own surroundings thinned. The room faded at the edges of his vision, and the face in the portrait sharpened with unnatural clarity. The gaze no longer seemed fixed on the camera that captured it, but angled, focused outward, as though the man in the image looked directly at Elias across time. Elias felt no panic, only inevitability. The boundary between observer and observed dissolved, leaving only recognition. He lowered his eyes and breathed slowly until the feeling receded, then rose and walked to the window. He opened the curtains for the first time in days. The city stretched below, indifferent and familiar, yet distant now, a world he no longer occupied in spirit. He closed the curtains again and returned to the desk. The awareness in the apartment no longer lingered at the edge of perception. It felt nearer, though still silent, still patient. Elias understood that whatever had followed him from the valley would not remain confined to photograph or memory much longer. The waiting was nearly over. He sensed that the time to choose had passed, and what came next would arrive without his consent or refusal. He went to bed without looking back at the desk. He closed his eyes, not to sleep but to rest in darkness. The room remained still. The presence remained near, and somewhere, in a place beyond visible distance, something that once lived behind a camera lens waited for him to open his eyes again. The sun never rose cleanly over Blackwood after that morning, as if something in the sky itself hesitated to look upon the town. Elias kept walking through the hollow streets with the same distant stare, ignoring the greetings of neighbors who had once warmed to him. Nothing seemed to reach him anymore. There was only the memory of that photograph, the one he had burned, and yet could still see whenever he closed his eyes. The air in Blackwood felt thinner, as though the town was slowly suffocating and forcing every soul to breathe beside its deathbed. Elias told himself there had to be a rational explanation. That exhaustion and grief had deceived him, but reason had begun to shrink beneath a quiet dread that coiled around his waking hours. He avoided the church at first. He avoided mirrors, avoided shutter clicks, avoided anything that could capture or reflect a moment in time. Yet the pull toward the lens returned regardless. He felt it in the stillness of abandoned barns, in the long cobblestone roads that vanished into mist, in the faint glimmers of candles glowing behind shuttered windows at night. He began waking with his camera already in his hands, fingers wrapped around cold brass, as though the device had climbed into his grasp while he slept. The world urged him to document something unseen, something waiting for him to surrender. He sensed it in the quiet, in the bending of shadows, in the way strangers stared longer than politeness allowed. Blackwood held its breath each night. The townspeople whispered of shared nightmares, of someone wandering in the fog, of a face standing beyond their windows just before dawn. No one spoke of it in daylight, but the fear lived in the corners of their eyes. Children stopped playing in the streets. Old men refused to sit outside. People bolted their doors before sunset. Something was changing the town, and Elias felt responsible without knowing why. The silence eventually became unbearable, so he walked back to his studio. The place had gone stale without him, as though the walls held on to the last night he had worked there. Dust clung to the tabletops and shelves like a burial cloth. His cameras sat in their cases like sleeping animals. At first he only touched them, afraid to wake the thing that had taken root in his life. But the moment his fingertips traced the polished wood of his favorite camera, his mind suddenly felt clearer, balanced, alive. He set the tripod. He adjusted the plates. His body moved from memory, but his spirit felt guided, as though another pair of invisible hands worked with him. He convinced himself he would take only one photograph. Not of people, not of himself. Only the empty studio, proof that normalcy still existed. The shutter opened. Time slowed. A calm settled over him. When he developed the plate, Elias expected nothing but a quiet, still life. Yet the image that formed in the solution was not the room he knew. The shapes were wrong. The shadows were deeper. The walls leaned inward as if breathing, and there faintly stood a blurred figure in the corner, taller than any man he knew, out of proportion, featureless. Watching him, he backed away and dropped the photograph to the floor. The face he could not see was more horrifying than any face that could have appeared. A presence without identity, a gaze without eyes, something older than reason captured by his own hand. Elias told himself to destroy it, but a whisper in his thoughts urged him to keep going, to continue, to uncover instead of run. His heart felt torn between terror and fascination, as though dread itself had become addictive. He told himself he could stop whenever he wished, but he already knew that was a lie. Night after night he ventured deeper into his work. Each photograph revealed more of the figure, as though it stepped closer each time. People began fading from the town. A farmer disappeared, then a widow, then a child. The whispers turned into silence. Doors stayed locked, windows boarded. Blackwood was curling inward like a dying leaf. Elias continued to photograph in secret, convinced that understanding the entity was the only way to stop whatever was happening. The figure grew clearer, taller, sharper, closer. Soon he began seeing it even without the lens, standing in distant fields half hidden in the trees reflected in window glass. Reality and image blurred until Elias feared sleep, for even dreams had begun to develop like photographs dipped into darkness. He lost track of days. Meals turned to ash in his mouth. The studio became a cell, and the camera became both obsession and torment. When he stepped outside, he found the town almost empty, as if Blackwood itself were vanishing frame by frame. No voices. No children, no bell, no birdsong at dawn. Only fog that never lifted, and houses that seemed to lean closer to the streets, listening. The world looked staged, frozen, waiting for him. Elias understood then that his photographs were not documenting events, but directing them. Everything he captured became truth. Every shutter was a verdict. He was not the witness, he was the author. There was only one photograph left to take. He felt it in his bones. A final image that would complete the sequence. One that would demand everything. Elias lit the lanterns in his studio and stared at the empty frame where the plate waited. His reflection stared back at him in the glass. Hollow eyes, pale skin. A stranger. The camera waited, hungry. The figure waited, closer than ever. Elias placed his hand on the cold metal and understood that this last portrait would not capture his life, but claim it. Still, he lifted the camera. He steadied his breath. He surrendered to the fate he had crafted through light and shadow. And on that final night in Blackwood, Elias took the photograph that ended him. The final flash of the shutter stole the last certainty from Elias's life. Once the plate was exposed, a terrible stillness settled over the studio. Not the quiet of an empty room, but the hush of something watching, waiting, breathing against the thin veil between worlds. Elias lowered the camera and felt as though a string had been cut inside him. His limbs grew weaker. His vision trembled at the edges. The studio seemed to tilt, as if the floorboards had loosened from the earth itself. He reached for the developing tray, fingers shaking, terrified and compelled in equal measure. He could not stop now. Whatever fate the photograph held, it had already taken root. All that remained was to see. The plate slid into the solution. The liquid rippled, silver rising like a dark tide around the glass. Shadows bloomed across the surface. Shapes emerged. Blackwood's familiar outlines materialized first. The studio, the narrow beams, the wall of cracked plaster behind him. But the image did not freeze there. More detail unfurled. Elias leaned closer, breath shallow, heart tightening. In the photograph, he saw himself standing before the camera, head bowed, arms limp, body slumped as though drained of breath and spirit. His own face stared back at him with the expression of a man already gone. But behind that lifeless version of himself rose the figure, fully formed now, towering, unmistakable, its limbs long and wrong, its presence swallowing the room in a void of intention. The photograph looked more alive than the moment it had captured. Elias stumbled back and the tray nearly slipped from his grip. He pressed against the wall, trembling. The image held a truth that had been stalking him from the moment he first lifted a camera. The figure had not been approaching him. It had been returning to him, welcoming him, claiming its rightful place. His life's work had not drawn something from the shadows. His lens had remembered it. Elias realized then that the horror was not an intruder, but something familiar, something ancient, something once connected to him. A bond formed long before his first memory. He tried to tear the photograph, but his body would not obey. His arms felt heavy as though unseen hands gripped them. He could not move away from the image. His feet rooted to the floorboards. He watched as his developed double stared back with empty, unblinking eyes. Reality flickered. For a moment Elias felt the studio dissolve, walls peeling back like wet paper. The world tilted again, and he saw Blackwood as if from a great height. The town lay in darkness, houses hollow, streets abandoned. Not a soul walked the land. The sky churned with clouds that never broke. The church steeple split the horizon like a blade. Blackwood was no longer dying, it was undone. The vision tightened, closing in. Elias felt himself pulled back into the studio where the photograph glistened under the lantern light. The figure in the image no longer belonged to the paper. Elias felt it in the room, behind him, beside him, surrounding him. The air thickened. The studio groaned. The lanterns dimmed. Something brushed the back of his neck. Cold, familiar, intimate. He turned, but nothing occupied the space his eyes could reach. Only the photograph saw the truth. His pulse slowed. The walls leaned closer. The world compressed into a shrinking circle of breath and shadow. He fled. The night swallowed him as he ran through the empty streets. Each house he passed stood silent, windows black, doors sealed by abandonment. Not even wind moved through Blackwood. The town had become a photograph itself, frozen at the brink of vanishing. Elias kept running, drawn by the only structure still lit by candlelight. The church door towered ahead of him, carved with saints whose faces had eroded into expressions of warning. The candles flickered in tall iron stands, as though burning in vigil for a congregation that would never return. He pushed through the heavy door and stepped into a sanctuary that smelled of dust and old hymns. Pews lined the aisle like ribs of a great carcass. Stained glass loomed overhead, showing biblical scenes cracked and warped by time. Their saints' eyes seemingly fixed on Elias with a knowing grief. The altar stood draped in crimson cloth, untouched by decay, as though waiting for a final rite. The silence stretched. Elias felt the weight of centuries pressing on him, urging him forward. If any salvation remained, it would be here. If any damnation awaited, it would claim him here as well. He moved toward the altar. Something pulled him onward, not by force, but by inevitability. His footsteps echoed in the hollow chamber, and each echo sounded less like a footstep and more like a second presence walking just a moment behind him. The candles sputtered. The stained glass dimmed. He reached the front of the church and lowered himself to his knees, though he could not decide if he knelt in prayer or surrender. His thoughts scattered beneath a single crushing certainty. He had never been the hunter. He had always been the vessel. The earth shifted beneath the church. The air thickened. The presence filled the sanctuary, no longer hidden in photographs but stepping into the world with him. Elias felt its shape without seeing it. An expanse of shadow pressing against the boundaries of form, something that remembered what it had been and hungered for what it would be again. He felt a thread connect his breath to it, his heartbeat to its return. Every photograph he had taken had not summoned the entity, but awakened his role in its emergence. The candles bowed in unison, flames shrinking but not dying. The altar cloth stirred, though there was no wind. Elias raised his head. The nave stretched longer now, distorted by an unseen horizon. The figure stood at the end of the aisle, tall, dark, terribly patient, no longer a smear of shadow or a whisper in the corners of a frame, but fully born into the space they shared. It waited without movement, without haste. Elias felt the last remnant of himself flicker, the final edge of his resistance crumble. There would be no pleading, no escape, no bargain. The church became the frame, the world became the plate, and Elias understood that his final photograph had not captured his death. It had captured his return. The figure advanced without footsteps, gliding through the center aisle as though the floor existed only to remember it had once carried weight. Elias tried to rise, but his body remained bound to the altar, as if the earth itself had decided he would kneel until the becoming was complete. The shadows lengthened, stretching toward him like roots. The church, once a sanctuary, now resembled the inside of a shutter, opening, closing, trapping reality in a single inevitable moment. The stained glass fractured. The saints' faces collapsed into unrecognizable swirls of color. Wax bled down the candles in thick rivers. The world shrank to the distance between Elias and the figure, a distance that no longer obeyed physical rules. The entity was both across the church and already at his shoulder, an echo occupying two places at once, fully formed yet still arriving. Elias felt a pressure inside his skull, as if old memories were waking, memories not his yet undeniably familiar. Faces he never met, lands he never walked, centuries that had passed before his birth. It all returned in a flood of terrible clarity. He had not discovered the figure through the camera. He had remembered it. The lens had always been a key. The studio, the plates, the photographs, each image had reopened a door that generations before him tried to seal. Somewhere in his bloodline an oath had been made and forgotten. Elias had broken that forgetting. The figure was not a stranger. It was an inheritance. The church exhaled dust from its rafters. The pews warped inward. The world outside the walls withered into silence. Elias felt the final thread inside him stretch, thin as wire, ready to snap. The entity loomed just beyond the altar rail. Its form bent the candlelight around it, a shape that refused a single outline. Not a demon, not a ghost. Something older, something vast. Elias did not look away. There was nothing left to flee from and nowhere left to flee to. The shutter had already fallen. The creature extended its hand, not in violence but invitation. Elias felt his heart loosen. Every breath slowed. His fear dissolved into numb acceptance. The lantern in his memory flickered, revealing the truth he had avoided. He had never been its victim. He had been chosen to carry the image forward, not to destroy it, not to resist it, to finish it. The final exposure required a witness, and Elias had always been that witness. The figure's hand passed through his chest without touch or wound, yet something inside him split open. Not flesh, not bone. His reflection shattered. The church spun. Light inverted. Elias saw himself standing behind a camera again. Only this time, he watched from outside his own body. The plate captured the moment of surrender. The image developed in darkness. His eyes in the photograph held no terror now, only recognition. The developing chemicals birthed the truth that speech, reason, and faith had all failed to name. He became the photograph, his body, the vessel stilled at the altar, hollow and upright, empty as a marionette frozen mid-pose. His consciousness sank into the image, sealed behind glass and silver. The entity stepped fully into the world, free at last of reflection. The church doors opened on their own. Dawn did not break. Morning never came. Blackwood fell silent. The town decayed around a single untouched photograph hanging in the ruins of the studio. Elias behind the camera, eyes open, waiting. Anyone who entered and stared long enough felt the pull. The camera that ended him waited for its next witness. The cycle did not end. The lens did not close. The exposure continued. The photographer did not vanish. He endured, watching, remembering, beckoning the next soul who believed a picture could not look back.